It was a calm afternoon in the affluent suburb of Greenwood Heights. For Officer Levi, it was just another routine day on patrol, but his mood shifted when he spotted a sleek black car driving through the neighborhood. It wasn't the type of car or driver he was used to seeing in this part of town, and something about it set him on edge. Without hesitation, he flipped on his sirens and sped up behind the car, signaling the driver to pull over. The vehicle came to a smooth stop at the curb, and Officer Levi stepped out of his cruiser, his hand resting on his holster as he approached the driver's side window. His eyes narrowed. Inside was a middle-aged black man dressed in a sharp business suit, sitting calmly with his hands on the wheel. "License and registration," Levi barked, his voice sharp. The man complied without hesitation, retrieving his wallet and pulling out his identification. He handed it to Levi, meeting his gaze with a steady, composed look. "What's the problem, officer?" the man asked, his tone respectful but firm. Levi glared at him, flipping through the documents without actually reading them. Something about the man's calm demeanor irked him. "You tell me," Levi replied with a smirk. "What are you doing around here?" "I'm on my way home," the man responded, his eyes never wavering. "I live just a few blocks away." Levi raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. He glanced back at the black car, as if expecting to find something wrong. "This your car?" The man nodded, his expression neutral. "Yes, it is." Levi leaned closer to the window, his voice lowering in suspicion. "You sure about that? You don't look like you belong around here." The man's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained calm. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm on my way home. Is there a reason for this stop?" Levi ignored the question, his mind racing with assumptions. He didn't care about the man's answers. All he saw was someone who didn't fit in with the people who usually populated this upscale neighborhood. The more Levi stared at him, the more determined he became to assert his authority. "Step out of the car," Levi ordered, his hand now fully on his gun. The man hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of refusing. He could see where this was heading, but he wasn't going to give Levi an excuse to escalate the situation further. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. Stepping out onto the sidewalk, Levi stood over him, glaring. "Turn around and put your hands on the car." "For what?" the man asked, his voice controlled but clearly irritated now. "For resisting," Levi snapped. "You're not answering my questions." "I've answered every question you've asked," the man said calmly, though his patience was wearing thin. "I haven't broken any laws." Levi took a step closer, his chest puffed out, fueled by a mixture of ego and prejudice. "I said put your hands on the car." Reluctantly, the man did as he was told, placing his hands on the sleek hood of his own vehicle. He could feel the eyes of nearby residents watching from their windows, but none of them would intervene. They never did. Levi began patting him down aggressively, searching for something, anything to justify his actions. But there was nothing. No weapons, no drugs, no stolen items. Just a well-dressed man who clearly didn't belong in Levi's mind. Satisfied with his display of power, Levi pulled back and crossed his arms, still glaring at the man. "What's your name?" The man turned his head slightly, his calm exterior finally cracking as he looked Levi squarely in the eyes. "Micah Reed." Levi froze for a second, as if the name should have triggered something, but he shrugged it off, dismissing the man as just another nobody. "Well, Mr. Reed, I'm going to run your license and see if you've got anything on your record." Reed nodded silently, enduring the humiliation. He knew better than to resist, but there was a fire burning behind his calm exterior. Levi had no idea who he was dealing with, and Reed wasn't going to reveal it just yet. There was a time and place for everything. As Levi walked back to his cruiser, Reed took a deep breath, glancing around at the neighborhood he called home. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened to him, but each time, it left a bitter taste in his mouth. He wasn't just any man driving through this part of town. He was Judge Micah Reed, one of the most respected legal figures in the state. But Officer Levi hadn't bothered to check his identification properly. He had already made up his mind about who Micah Reed was before the stop even began. Back in his cruiser, Levi ran the license through the system, not realizing the gravity of his mistake. To him, it was just another routine stop, a chance to flex his authority over someone who didn't belong. He hadn't noticed the small detail on Reed's license, his title as a judge. As Levi sat in his car waiting for the results, he smirked, still convinced that Reed was hiding something. He glanced over at the man still standing by the car, and a small part of him felt satisfaction in putting Reed in his place. But Reed wasn't just a man in a suit, and this wasn't going to end the way Levi thought it would. Standing by his car, Micah Reed maintained his composure, but his patience was running thin. He had endured situations like this before, but it never got easier. The blatant abuse of power, the assumptions, the disrespect, it was something he had fought against his entire life. As a judge, he had seen the impact of systemic racism firsthand. But today, he was the one being targeted. In the patrol car, Officer Levi was still convinced that something was off about Reed. His name, his calm demeanor. It all made Levi feel like this man was hiding something. He hadn't found any outstanding warrants or issues with Reed's license, but that didn't stop him from wanting to push further. After what felt like an eternity, Levi stepped out of his cruiser, his jaw set with determination. The power he wielded as a police officer felt intoxicating, especially in moments like these when he could assert control over someone who seemed too sure of themselves. Walking up to Reed, Levi tossed the man's license back at him without a word of apology. "You're clear, but you're acting suspicious. Why were you driving so slow through this neighborhood?" Reed took a deep breath, gripping his license tightly before sliding it back into his wallet. "I was obeying the speed limit, officer. There was nothing suspicious about it." Levi narrowed his eyes, stepping closer, invading Reed's personal space. "You know, people who have nothing to hide don't get so defensive." Reed straightened, not backing down. "I'm not being defensive. I've answered all your questions. I've complied with everything you've asked. There's no reason for this to continue." But Levi wasn't listening. In his mind, Reed was challenging his authority, and that wasn't something he could tolerate. "You don't get to tell me how this works," Levi snapped. "I asked the questions. You answer them." The tension between the two men thickened. Reed could feel his anger rising, but he knew he couldn't let it show. The last thing he wanted was for Levi to escalate the situation further, but he could sense that it was already heading in that direction. "What are you hiding?" Levi asked again, his voice laced with accusation. "Why don't you just come clean now, and this will go a lot easier for you?" Reed's eyes hardened. He had been trying to avoid this, but Levi wasn't giving him a choice. "I'm not hiding anything. I've done nothing wrong." Levi scoffed, a mocking smile forming on his lips. "We'll see about that. Turn around and put your hands on the car." Reed's heart sank. This was exactly what he had feared. Levi was looking for an excuse, any excuse, to assert his authority, and now it was clear that the officer had crossed a line. "Officer," Reed said, his voice steady but firm, "there's no reason for this. I'm not under arrest, and you have no right to detain me." Levi's face twisted with anger. "I said put your hands on the car." When Reed hesitated, trying to reason with the officer, Levi grabbed him by the arm roughly, forcing him of the situation settled over Reed. But he remained composed. He was used to playing the long game, and this time would be no different. Officer Levi slammed the car door shut, his frustration palpable. He turned back toward the growing crowd, his face hard and defiant. The onlookers' murmurs grew louder, some openly expressing their disbelief at what they were witnessing. Several phones were still pointed in his direction, capturing every move, but Levi seemed oblivious or indifferent. Back at the station, Isaac Myers watched the live body cam feed, his concern deepening with every passing second. He grabbed his radio again, his voice stern and commanding. "Levi, I told you to bring him in by the book. Do not escalate this situation further." Levi didn't respond, his focus solely on maintaining his perceived authority. He climbed into the front seat of the cruiser, glancing briefly in the rearview mirror at Reed, who sat silently, his expression unreadable. As the cruiser pulled away, the crowd slowly began to disperse, though many lingered, shaking their heads and talking amongst themselves about what they had just witnessed. The videos they had recorded would soon find their way onto social media, sparking a wave of outrage that Levi could never have anticipated. Inside the cruiser, the tension was thick. Levi clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He couldn't shake the feeling of losing control, even though he had seemingly won. Reed, on the other hand, sat quietly, his calm demeanor unshaken. "You think this is over?" Levi sneered, breaking the silence. "You're going to learn today that you don't mess with me." Reed finally spoke, his voice steady. "Officer, I'm not the one who's going to learn something today." Levi shot him a glare through the rearview mirror but said nothing. The rest of the drive was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the police radio. When they arrived at the station, Levi parked the cruiser and yanked the door open, pulling Reed out roughly. He marched him inside, ignoring the curious glances from other officers. Reed didn't resist, his movements deliberate and controlled, as though he were already preparing for what was to come. Isaac Myers met them in the booking area, his expression a mix of anger and concern. He took one look at Reed, then turned his sharp gaze on Levi. "Take those cuffs off him." "Now," Myers ordered, his voice firm. Levi hesitated, his pride still driving him to push back. He was resisting. "Don't lie to me, Levi," Myers snapped, cutting him off. "I've been watching the whole thing on your body, Cammy. Take them off." Reluctantly, Levi complied, unlocking the cuffs and stepping back, his jaw clenched in frustration. Reed rubbed his wrist briefly but said nothing, his calm gaze fixed on Myers. "Mr. Reed," Myers said, his tone shifting to one of respect, "I sincerely apologize for what happened out there. If you'd like to file a complaint—" Reed raised a hand, stopping him. "Isaac, I appreciate your concern, but this is bigger than a complaint." Myers frowned, sensing the gravity of Reed's words. "What do you mean?" Reed straightened, his presence commanding even in the police station. "I'm Judge Micah Reed, and what your officer did today wasn't just an abuse of power. It was a violation of the law. I'll be addressing this matter formally." The room fell silent. Levi's face went pale as the weight of Reed's words sank in. He opened his mouth to protest but quickly shut it, realizing there was nothing he could say to justify his actions now. Myers sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Judge Reed, I assure you, this will be handled appropriately. I'll make sure of it." Reed nodded, his expression unreadable. "I trust that it will. But I won't be waiting passively for your department to act. There are consequences for actions like this, Isaac. I hope you understand that." With that, Reed turned and walked out of the station, his steps measured and purposeful. The room remained silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Levi stood frozen, his mind racing. He had thought he was in control, but now he realized the tables had turned completely. The videos, the body cam footage, the fact that Reed was a judge, it was all a damning combination. As the door closed behind Reed, Isaac Myers turned to Levi, his expression cold and unyielding. "You're suspended, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and gun." Levi's face twisted with disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I'm dead serious," Myers interrupted, his voice low but firm. "You crossed the line, Levi, and now you're going to face the consequences. Get out of my sight." Levi hesitated, his pride fighting against the reality of the situation, but he knew there was no point in arguing. Slowly, he removed his badge and gun, placing them on the counter before turning and walking out of the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Back outside, Micah Reed stood by the curb, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. He could still feel the sting of the handcuffs on his wrists, but it was nothing compared to the fire burning in his chest. Justice would be served, and he would make sure of it. As he walked to his car, he glanced back at the station one last time. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had endured similar injustices, but didn't have the means to fight back. This was far from over. Toward the back of the station, the weight of his actions finally beginning to dawn on him. The realization of who Micah Reed truly was hit him like a freight train, and for the first time that day, Levi felt a flicker of doubt. Isaac Myers, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, stepped out of his office and intercepted Levi. His expression was a mix of anger and disbelief. "Levi, get in my office, now." Levi hesitated but complied, leaving Reed in the holding area. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Myers shut the door behind them and faced the younger officer. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Myers began, his voice sharp and controlled. "What do you mean?" Levi asked, still clinging to a shred of defiance. "I followed procedure. The guy was acting suspicious." Myers slammed his hand on the desk, startling Levi. "Suspicious? You arrested Judge Micah Reed, one of the most respected judges in this state. You didn't even bother to check his ID properly before escalating the situation." Levi's face went pale. "Judge," he stammered, the full weight of his mistake crashing down on him. "Yes, Judge Micah Reed," Myers snapped. "And thanks to your reckless behavior, this department is about to face a storm like you've never seen. Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" Levi sat in stunned silence, unable to respond. Meanwhile, in the holding area, Reed remained seated on the cold bench, his composure unshaken. When his attorney, Elliot Walters, arrived, the mood in the station shifted noticeably. Walters' reputation preceded him. His sharp suit and air of authority were enough to command immediate respect. As Walters approached the holding area, he addressed Levi coldly. "I'm here to see Judge Micah Reed." Levi blinked, his earlier bravado completely evaporating. "Wait, what did you just say?" "You heard me," Walters replied, his tone icy. "Judge Micah Reed." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The officers nearby exchanged uneasy glances as the reality of the situation began to spread. Levi's face turned a shade paler, and the confidence he had wielded all day crumbled. Walters turned his piercing gaze to Myers, who had just stepped out of his office. "Isaac, I trust you're aware of the magnitude of this situation," Walters said, his voice measured but firm. Myers nodded grimly. "We're working to resolve it, Mr. Walters. This is a misunderstanding." Reed, who had been sitting silently behind the bars, finally spoke, his voice calm, yet commanding. "Isaac Myers, this goes far beyond a misunderstanding." Myers sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, Judge Reed. Believe me, I'm doing everything I can to address this. Levi will face the consequences of his actions." Walters stepped closer to the cell, his tone unwavering. "I'll make sure of that. But first we need to get Judge Reed out of here. Now." Myers nodded and signaled for the officer on duty to unlock the cell. As the door swung open, Reed stood, his movements deliberate and composed. Walters handed him his personal belongings, and together they walked toward the exit, leaving a trail of stunned silence in their wake. Levi watched them go, his stomach churning. He knew his career was hanging by a thread. The reality of what he had done and the consequences that would follow were inescapable now. As Reed and Walters stepped outside into the evening air, a small crowd of reporters and onlookers had already begun to gather. Word of the arrest had spread quickly, and cameras flashed as Walters addressed the media. Today, Judge Micah Reed was unlawfully detained and humiliated by an officer who failed to uphold the basic principles of justice and professionalism, Walters said, his voice clear and authoritative. "We will be pursuing this matter to ensure accountability, not just for Judge Reed, but for everyone who has suffered from similar abuses of power." Reed stood silently beside him, his calm demeanor radiating strength. This was not just about him. This was about the systemic issues that had allowed such an incident to occur. And now, with the eyes of the public on them, justice would take its course. Inside the station, Myers sat at his desk, his head in his hands. He knew the department was in for a rough road ahead. Levi, still frozen in disbelief, replayed the events of the day in his mind, realizing too late that his arrogance and prejudice had led him to ruin. For Judge Micah Reed, this was far from over. The wheels of justice were already in motion, and the fallout from this day would serve as a powerful reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. voice reduced to a shaky murmur. "I didn't know, Sarge. I didn't realize who he was." Myers shook his head, his expression hard. "You didn't realize? It was your job to check his ID. You didn't even bother to look properly, did you? You just assumed." Levi swallowed hard, the reality of his mistake crashing down on him once again. He had always operated with an air of untouchable arrogance, but now, faced with the enormity of what he had done, that arrogance was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, Judge Reed stood calmly in the lobby, his attorney Jonathan Mitchell at his side. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as officers exchanged glances, some avoiding eye contact with the judge entirely. The tension was palpable. Mitchell turned to Reed, speaking in a low voice. "We'll make sure this is handled appropriately. The department needs to understand the gravity of what happened here." Reed nodded, his gaze steady as he observed the scene unfolding around him. "They'll understand soon enough. Actions have consequences, and this is no exception." Across the room, Myers dragged Levi into his office, slamming the door shut behind them. The Isaac's voice was low but furious as he leaned across the desk. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You didn't just arrest anyone. You humiliated and assaulted one of the most powerful judges in the state. This isn't just a mistake, Levi. This is career-ending." Levi's face was pale, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to defend himself. "I thought he was just some guy acting suspicious. I didn't know." "Exactly," Myers snapped. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to check, and now we're all going to pay for your stupidity." In the lobby, Mitchell turned toward the cluster of officers who had gathered nearby. "I want to make it very clear that Judge Reed and I will be pursuing this matter to its fullest extent." Officer Levi's actions were not only unprofessional, but they also violated Judge Reed's rights. This kind of behavior is unacceptable, and there will be consequences. The officers shifted uncomfortably, many casting nervous glances toward the judge. Reed remained calm, but his presence alone carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Myers finally emerged from his office, his face grim as he approached Mitchell and Reed. "Judge Reed," he began, his tone measured, "I want to personally apologize for what happened here today. This should never have happened. Rest assured, Officer Levi will be held accountable." Reed looked at Myers, his expression unreadable. "Isaac, I appreciate your words, but apologies won't fix what's broken. This isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows officers like Levi to abuse their power without accountability. That ends today." Myers nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the situation. "I understand, Your Honor. I'll make sure the internal investigation is thorough." Reed turned to Mitchell, signaling that it was time to leave. As they walked toward the exit, the room fell silent once again. Every eye followed them, the weight of what had transpired hanging heavy in the air. Levi remained in Myers's office, staring at his hands as the magnitude of his actions set in. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, but now he realized how wrong he had been. His arrogance and disregard for procedure had led him to ruin, and there was no way to undo the damage. Outside, as Reed and Mitchell stepped into the cool evening air, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Mitchell raised a hand to signal for quiet before addressing the press. Today, Judge Micah Reed was unlawfully detained and mistreated by an officer who abused his authority. This was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger problem within our justice system. We will ensure that justice is served, not just for Judge Reed, but for everyone who has experienced this kind of injustice. Reed stood beside him, his calm and dignified presence lending weight to every word. He knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about shining a light on a broken system and holding those responsible accountable. Back inside the station, Levi sat alone, his head in his hands. The weight of his mistake was suffocating, and the realization that his career was likely over loomed large. He had thought he was in control, but now he understood how wrong he had been. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, and there was no stopping them now. The surface. He shook his head, his voice shaky. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know who he was. I thought he was just some guy giving me attitude, acting suspicious. Arya frowned, her worry shifting to disbelief. Acting suspicious? That's it? That's why you cuffed him and dragged him to the station? You didn't even bother to check his ID properly? I glanced at it. Levi muttered defensively, though the excuse felt hollow even to him. But he didn't tell me he was a judge. Arya's expression hardened, her tone sharp. He didn't have to tell you. You're supposed to treat everyone with respect, regardless of who they are. That's your job, Levi. You're not supposed to assume or escalate. Levi stood abruptly, pacing the room. I know, okay? I know I screwed up, but it's too late now. Everyone's already decided I'm a racist cop who abuses his power. Arya's voice softened slightly, but the disappointment lingered. Maybe because that's how it looks. You let your pride and assumptions take over, and now it's not just your career on the line. It's our lives, Levi. Our family's reputation. Levi slumped back onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The weight of her words hit him harder than he expected. He had been so focused on maintaining control, on proving his authority, that he hadn't stopped to think about the bigger picture, the damage he was causing to himself, to others, and to his own family. Meanwhile, outside the Baywood Police Department, the protests had grown larger and louder. Crowds filled the streets, their chants echoing through the night. Signs reading "Justice for Reed and End Police Brutality" were held high as the community rallied against the injustice they had witnessed. In the midst of the chaos, Judge Micah Reed sat in his office at home, reviewing legal documents with his lawyer, Jonathan Mitchell. The events of the past few days had been draining, but Reed's resolve remained unshaken. Mitchell closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, eyeing Reed carefully. The DOJ is digging deep into the department's history. If they find systemic issues, and I'm certain they will, it's going to open the floodgates. Are you ready for that? Reed nodded, his voice calm and measured. I've been ready for this my whole career. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been treated unfairly, everyone who's been silenced. If this case can shine a light on the deeper problems, then it's worth it. Mitchell gave a small smile, admiration in his eyes. You've got more patience than most people would in your position, but Levi is going to face serious consequences, whether he's ready for them or not. Reed sighed softly, glancing at the stack of papers on his desk. He'll have to. Actions have consequences. What he did was more than a mistake. It was a violation of trust, of duty, and he needs to understand that. Back in his apartment, Levi stared blankly at the dark TV screen, his thoughts spiraling. He could hear the faint sound of chants from the protests outside the station, a constant reminder of the storm he had caused. His phone buzzed again, and this time he reluctantly picked it up. It was a message from a colleague. The chief's making a public statement tomorrow. You might want to prepare for the worst. Levi's grip tightened on the phone. He knew what that meant. His suspension would be official, and the department would likely distance themselves from him to protect their own image. He was on his own now. Arya placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but firm. You need to take responsibility, Levi. Own up to what you did. It's the only way we can start to move forward. Levi nodded slowly, though he wasn't sure how to face what was coming. The fallout had already begun, and there was no escaping it. Levi's voice was now weak and shaky as he glanced nervously at Reed, who was quietly conversing with his lawyer. He didn't say anything about being a judge. He was just acting suspicious. Myers glared at him, his eyes blazing with anger. Acting suspicious? You just arrested one of the most respected judges in the state. And for what? Driving through his own neighborhood? Levi's stomach dropped. He knew Myers was right. There was no justification for what he had done, and the fact that it was Judge Reed only made things worse. The consequences of his actions were starting to become terrifyingly clear. I thought he was hiding something, Levi muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Myers shook his head, disgusted. You're a damn fool. Do you even realize what kind of trouble we're in now? This isn't some minor incident we can sweep under the rug. This is going to blow up in our faces. Levi swallowed hard, his palms sweaty. His mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. But the more he thought, the more he realized there was no escape. He had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. In the next room, Judge Micah Reed sat with his lawyer, watching the chaos unfold. He had known this moment would come, the moment when Levi realized just how badly he had messed up. Reed could see the panic in the officer's eyes, the way his bravado had crumbled in the face of the truth. "You could have revealed who you were from the start," the lawyer said quietly, his voice curious but respectful. Reed nodded, his eyes still on Levi. "I could have, but then he wouldn't have shown his true colors." The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "And now?" "Now he faces the consequences," Reed said simply, his tone calm but resolute. "People like Levi rely on their power and intimidation. He thought he could bully me because of what I looked like. He never cared to check my ID, never bothered to listen. He just saw what he wanted to see." The lawyer gave a slight nod of understanding. "So, what's the plan?" Reed sighed softly. "Let the department handle it first. I want to see if they're willing to do the right thing. But if they try to sweep this under the rug, well, I won't stay silent." Reed had no intention of letting Levi off the hook, but he wanted to see how the police department would respond. If they failed to take appropriate action, he would have no problem taking this case to the courts and to the public. Back in the station, Isaac Myers was frantically trying to control the damage. He ordered Levi to take a seat in the back office while he consulted with the department's legal team and the chieftain. The reality of what had happened was beginning to sink in for everyone. The police department was now in the middle of a potential PR disaster, and they had no idea how to get out of it. Levi sat in the office, staring blankly at the wall. The adrenaline that had fueled him earlier was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. He had always operated with a sense of invincibility, believing that the badge protected him from the consequences of his actions. But now, the badge felt more like a target. He could lose everything: his job, his reputation, and possibly face legal action. His thoughts spiraled as he imagined the fallout. He pictured his face plastered across news outlets, social media erupting with outrage, protesters outside the station, and, worst of all, Judge Reed standing in court delivering the verdict that would ruin his life. The panic in Levi's chest tightened, making it hard to breathe. He had screwed up, and now there was nothing he could do to fix it. Hours later, after several frantic meetings and hushed discussions, Harry Alexander entered the office where Levi sat. His face was gray, and he looked as though the weight of the situation had aged him years in just a few hours. "Levi," the chief began, his voice low and serious, "you've put us all in a terrible position. I've spoken with legal, and we're placing you on immediate suspension pending an investigation." Levi felt like the ground had fallen out from under him. "Suspension?" His voice was hollow, his mind still reeling. Harry Alexander nodded, but his face was anything but sympathetic. "You assaulted and arrested a judge without cause. This is beyond bad. You're lucky if suspension is all you get." The words stung like a slap to the face. Levi had always thought of himself as a cop who could push boundaries, who could use his authority to assert control. But now, that same authority was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the chief left the room, Levi was left alone with his thoughts once more. His mind raced as he tried to grasp the full extent of his situation. This was the beginning of the end, and the fear of what was to come gnawed at him like a slow-burning fire. Meanwhile, Judge Reed and his lawyer walked out of the station, passing by the protesters who had begun to gather. News of the incident had already spread, and the community was rallying behind Reed. They wanted justice, and they weren't going to let this go quietly. Reed glanced back at the station as they left, knowing that Levi's reckoning was only just beginning. The wheels of justice were turning, and soon Levi would face the full force of the consequences he had so arrogantly ignored.